We're now going to look at the signs and symptoms of abuse in children. But before we start, I just want to say to you that I don't want you to jump to conclusions, because when we think about the kind of lives that children live, they have all sorts of adventures. They live an active life, and bumps and bruises will occur in all sorts of ways. And they're perfectly normal, natural, nothing at all for us to be bothered about. However, I would now like to say that if we think about bruises on a baby, for example, babies do not have the same active lifestyle, and if a doctor were to see bruises on a baby, the doctor would want to know what had caused those. Is it that the baby perhaps has some kind of medical condition that's causing bruises, swellings, those sort of things? Or maybe there is a possibility that this is a non-accidental injury. So now we'll look then at the kind of bumps and bruises and marks that would cause us concern. For example, 2 black eyes, bruising behind the ears, the outline of an object in bruising, fingertip bruising, marks as though someone's been tied up. Those are the kind of things that we would be concerned about. And bite marks. Now, I do know, obviously, that small children will sometimes try out their shiny new teeth on other brothers and sisters. But I'm afraid to say that adults also do that. So again, that is something that we should be concerned about. And if we were to say to a child with these bruises or marks, "Oh, that looks nasty, how did that happen?" And they tell you and you think, "I don't know. I can't believe it could possibly have happened like that. Besides, this is not the first time we've been concerned about this child. I really think I ought to take some advice." Yes, you should be taking advice, because in the past, people have failed children and young people. They've not done what they needed to do. And sadly, churches have also failed children in that way. So take advice. It may be that you would be expected to take advice from someone in your denomination. Certainly you'd be speaking to your safeguarding coordinator. And CCPAS has a 24-hour helpline. You can always contact us. So please don't be afraid to do that, because it's better to take advice and then think, "Oh, well, I needn't have bothered, that was all right," than to do nothing and then bitterly regret it later. So going further down our list, let's have a look then at some of the other things that would cause us concerns. Repeated urinary infections, water infections. Okay, children will get them from time to time, but a child that's being sexually abused is much more likely to get those infections, and certainly a doctor would want to investigate that, particularly if it's a child below the age of puberty, to see if perhaps there is something else going on, perhaps some sexual abuse. And what about those unexplained tummy pains? Maybe it's you've asked a child to go and tidy up their room or get ready for school, and suddenly they're doubled up in pain. They just don't fancy doing what you've asked them to do. But maybe there's something more going on here. Maybe this child is getting bullied on the way to school and they are frightened to go to school. Maybe there is some perhaps undiagnosed medical condition which needs looking into. So just things to bear in mind. We're now going to look at a picture, and I just want you to take a moment or two to look at this picture and to decide what your concerns are about it, what marks those are that you can see, and then we'll pick it up after that. Now you've had a chance to have a look at that picture, let's look at some of the possible explanations there could be for it. Some people might say, well, perhaps someone has grabbed this child so hard that it's left bruising on the skin. Others of you may have said, well, it looks like cigarette burns to me. Others may have thought that perhaps it's insect bites or some kind of skin blemish. You might even have said some other things. But what I have to say is that, sadly, it was cigarette burns. And it was the parent of that child who did it to him. And it's pretty horrible to think that somebody could do that kind of thing to a child. But so that sadly that was the case. Now, somebody might say, well, I was smoking a cigarette and they bumped into me. Well, would it have left 3 identical marks on that child's skin? And look at where those marks are. They're on the inner aspect of the child's arm. And I'm afraid we can say that there is no other possibility that this actually was deliberately stabbing out a cigarette on this little boy. And that is horrible. But I want you to imagine now that somebody comes to your group, your activity, and you see what looks like cigarette burns on their body somewhere or other. Let's think about some of the other possible explanations that there might be. Perhaps this child wanted to join a gang, and they've said, yeah, you can join, but let's see how brave you are, and if you can take the pain, yep, you can join. I'd be worried if that was my child. Perhaps this child is being bullied. Now, we know that bullying is a big problem, much bigger than perhaps we wanted to say in the past. And there is some research that has been done by the NSPCC which links very closely children who have committed suicide and being bullied. Now, that's something that we do need to bear in mind. And the other possibility that we have on our list is that perhaps this child is self-harming. Now, why would somebody want to self-harm? There could be a number of reasons. It could be this kind of pressure of exams coming up, things going on at home. But we do know there is a strong link between sexual abuse and self-harm. Sometimes harming oneself is the only bit of their life that they can take control over. And it's something that can become addictive behaviour. Of course, self-harm is not just cigarette burns. I mean, it can include cutting, scratching, substance abuse, the eating disorders. Some of these people who are self-harming may need professional help. Some of them are going to need medical help, and they may need to get to hospital now. Maybe they are dripping blood, or they tell you they have swallowed some noxious substance. So you're going to need to get them first aid quickly. Whether they need professional help or not, they will need people who are prepared to show they care, people who will listen to them and not condemn them for behaving in this way. That may be enough to get them through this crisis. If we're talking about a child who's self-harming, then you really must take advice, because it may well be that this child needs to be protected from harm, and it may be that we have to involve children's social services in order for them to get that help and safety. If you want to know more about the subject, there's a couple of useful websites going up on the screen now. CCPAS also has some useful resources on our website, some books that may help you to understand these issues rather better. Let's look now at the signs and symptoms of neglect. Now, you might spot the neglected child or young person who comes to one of your activities just by using your eyes or maybe your nose. Because maybe this is a child whose clothes are unwashed, their bodies are unwashed, and I'm not talking about teenagers who've yet to discover the benefits of washing. What we're looking at is a child who really is looking uncared for. Maybe they look pale, thin, undernourished. And, maybe this is the child who comes first to your group and is the last to leave, and you never ever see their parents. Maybe this is a child who's really not getting the care and attention that they need. This is a very vulnerable child, because there are sexual predators in our society who have an uncanny way of targeting these children, the children who are hungry for love. I just want you to be aware of the vulnerability, particularly of some of these neglected children. Looking at the signs and symptoms of emotional abuse, it's always part of the other sorts of abuse, but it can be something that stands on its own. Because if you're a child who's constantly told you're rubbish, you'll never amount to anything, you're a mistake, wish you'd never been born, wish I'd had you aborted, you're a child of the devil, you're a witch, truly that is emotionally abusive. And then if you think about the child that's witnessing or hearing domestic abuse, The adults in the household screaming and shouting at each other, throwing the furniture, hurting each other. What does that do to that child? What is it going to do to that child if they try to step between those warring adults and then get physically hurt? What impact is it going to have on their parenting abilities as they grow up? And then if we look at parents who've got long-term health issues, psychiatric disorders, addictive conditions, and you're a child who is having to look after your parent, well, we need to remember that children have rights. Children have a right to have a childhood, and if they are spending their time caring for their parent, then they're missing out on that. And we just need to be aware of those kinds of issues, because we can call them young carers, but they are children. They're children first. Now, whatever kind of abuse a child or young person may have experienced, you may well see changes in their behaviour. The child who was bright, bubbly, full of fun, and suddenly becomes very withdrawn, very quiet, kind of lost looking, not relating to people anymore. Maybe, in fact, they become very aggressive, attention-seeking, angry. What is going on in their life? Now, make allowances for the fact that we all have bad days. But if this is something that's become now a pattern of their behaviour, then we need to ask ourselves what's going on in their life. And if we actually spend time getting to know the children and young people that we are working with, then maybe they will feel able to trust us with the things that are troubling them. Some of the other things that are on that list: underachievement, lack of concentration. For a child who's been sexually abused, for example, how do you kind of deal with normal things in life? Things like homework, when you have got running through your head the kind of things that are happening when you go to bed at night and someone comes into your room. You know, those kind of things that are quite scary. And we may well find that children don't do well at school because of all that's going on in their head. On the other hand, school may be the one place where they feel valued and they can do remarkably well. So you may well see some of the other kinds of things on that list: attention-seeking behaviour, running away, stealing, lying. But again, don't jump to conclusions, because sometimes these things happen anyway. When we're looking at signs and symptoms of sexual abuse, it is so difficult for a child or young person to talk about what has happened to them. How can you make sense of something that perhaps you don't even have the words for? Maybe you do have the words for it, but how can you talk about that stuff? Maybe you've been threatened or bribed not to tell. And so if someone actually manages to break the silence barrier and talk, that is pretty unusual. Jane Gratian has written an amazing book called Goodbye Pink Room. And it helps you to look at what it is like to be a child who's experiencing this kind of thing. Certainly something worth having a look at. Let's look at some of the other things on our list then. Now, although I've said that children will find it very difficult to say something, they might try and find a way to drop clues. And certainly for an older child or young person, they very well might write stuff that gives a hint of what is happening in their life. A younger child might draw pictures and that show some kind of sexual activity happening. But what about the little child in the creche, the nursery, the playgroup? We have had nursery workers who've contacted us and said, just can't believe it, the sexually explicit language that's coming out of this child's mouth, coupled with the very sexually explicit behaviour, even going as far as simulating intercourse with other children or toys. I mean, this is not something that you can afford to ignore. You must do something about that. We've got some other things on our list, the kind of sleeping problems, terrible dreams that people may have in regard to the sexual abuse that they have suffered. And particularly I'd like you to notice unexplained absences from home, evasiveness about boyfriend, behavioural changes in a young person. In the light of sexual exploitation crimes that have taken place, this is something that parents have noticed and said, oh, if only we'd realised what was going on. If only we'd asked them about some of this stuff, we might have been able to stop it from happening. So that's just something to flag up. want to say a few words now about racial, cultural and religious factors. We live in a multicultural society. There are many languages being spoken, and we have to remember that because some of the children from the families in our community may be coming to our activities, and they may find it difficult to say what is going on because they don't actually have the language skills to say so. We know that people live and parent differently, and that's fine. But we mustn't make so many allowances for the fact that they are parenting in a different way that actually we begin to overlook physically abusive or neglectful behaviour. Because the bottom line is, all children have the right to be protected from harm.